On that warm April evening in 1845, when the moon rose full and luminous over the cotton fields of Crescent Hill Plantation in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, 25-year-old Mistress Eleanor Whitmore stood at her chamber window and watched the lunar disk climb above the tree line. And she felt the familiar stirring of desire mixed with power. For this was the night she would begin a ritual that would continue for 3 years. A pattern that would become whispered legend among the enslaved community. A cycle of violation repeated with each full moon until finally the weight of accumulated evil collapsed upon itself and destroyed everything it touched. And if this story grips your heart, leave your like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because what you're about to hear is a truth so disturbing, so systematic in its cruelty, that it reveals the depths of depravity possible when human beings are treated as property to be used according to the whims of their owners. Eleanor had been married at age 22 to Colonel James Whitmore, a man 40 years her senior, owner of Crescent Hill's 1,500 acres and 140 enslaved souls who worked the cotton that made the Whitmore family one of the wealthiest in Alabama. The marriage had been arranged by Eleanor's father, a bankrupt Charleston aristocrat desperate to secure his daughter's future. And Eleanor had gone to her wedding like a prisoner walking to the gallows, knowing she was trading one form of bondage for another, exchanging her father's authority for her husband's, becoming property herself in all but legal definition. Colonel Whitmore was not cruel by the standards of the time, but he was cold, distant. A man who viewed marriage as a business arrangement and his wife as an investment that should produce returns in the form of heirs and proper household management. He spent his nights in his study with brandy and account books, rarely visiting Eleanor's chamber, and the loneliness that consumed her was like a living thing gnawing at her insides, creating a void that grew larger and hungrier with each passing month. The idea came to her on the first full moon after her 25th birthday, as she stood at her window unable to sleep, watching the silver light transform the plantation into something otherworldly, and she thought about the power she possessed, the absolute authority she held over every enslaved person on Crescent Hill, and she realized that she could fill her emptiness, could assert some control over her life, by exercising the only power she had, which was power over those even more powerless than herself. She chose carefully that first time, selected a man named William, age 32, who worked as a field hand, strong and silent, a man who had been at Crescent Hill for 15 years and was known for his dignity and his devotion to his wife and 3 children. Eleanor sent for him through Bessie, her personal maid, told Bessie to bring William to the big house after the household had retired, and when he arrived, confused and frightened, Eleanor explained in a voice that brooked no argument what she expected of him, and she made clear the consequences if he refused, made clear that she could have him sold away from his family, could have his wife and children scattered to different plantations, could destroy everything he held dear with a single word. William did what she demanded because he had no choice, because survival and protecting his family required submission, and when it was over and she dismissed him back to the quarters, Eleanor felt something like triumph, felt that she had taken something back from the world that had taken everything from her, felt power coursing through her veins like a drug that demanded more, demanded repetition, demanded escalation. And so the pattern began. With the next full moon she chose a different man, this time Aaron, aged 28, who worked in the stables, and the moon after that she chose Benjamin, the carpenter's assistant. And with each full moon for 3 years, she selected a different enslaved man, sometimes repeating choices if a particular man had pleased her, sometimes choosing men who were married to make the violation more complete, sometimes choosing younger men barely past boyhood. And the pattern became known throughout the quarters, became a source of dread as each full moon approached, and the men wondered who would be chosen next, who would have to climb those stairs to the big house and surrender their dignity, their self-respect, their very humanity to satisfy the desires of a woman who had been given absolute power over their lives. The enslaved community at Crescent Hill learned to track the lunar cycle, Learn to recognize the signs that preceded each selection, the way Eleanor would watch certain men during the day, the way her eyes would follow them as they worked. And the wives and mothers of these men lived in constant anxiety, knowing that any month their husband or son might be the one summoned, might return changed and broken, might carry scars invisible to the eye but devastating to the soul. Some of the men Eleanor chose never recovered, like Jacob, who hanged himself 6 months after his night in the big house, or Michael, who tried to run away and was caught and sold to a brutal plantation in Mississippi, or young Thomas, who was only 17 when she chose him, and who afterward developed a stutter and nervous tremors that never went away. Other men found ways to cope, to compartmentalize the violation, to protect their families by bearing the burden silently. But they all carried the weight of what happened to them, carried it like invisible chains heavier than any iron shackles. Who heard this story could not remain indifferent, just as you should not remain indifferent if this story touched you. Leave your like so it won't be forgotten, because what happened next proves that even the most systematic evil eventually collapses under its own weight. That oppression so total creates the conditions for its own destruction. The pattern continued for 36 months, 36 full moons, and Eleanor kept a diary hidden in a secret compartment of her writing desk. A diary where she recorded the name of each man, the date, and her assessment of the encounter, treating these human beings like specimens in some grotesque experiment, rating them, comparing them, describing them with clinical detachment that made their humanity invisible even to herself. But in the 37th month, in May of 1848, Eleanor made a mistake. She chose a man named Josiah, age 35, who, unlike the others, had something she had not anticipated. He had nothing left to lose. His wife had died in childbirth the previous year along with the baby. His parents had been sold south years earlier. He had no siblings, no children, no ties that could be used to threaten him into compliance. And when Eleanor made her usual threats about destroying his family, Josiah looked at her with eyes empty of fear and said, "Mistress, you can't take nothing from me 'cause I got nothing left. You already taken everything that mattered, so if you gonna do this, you gonna have to force me, 'cause I ain't going willing. Not this time. Not never again." Eleanor was shocked. No one had ever refused her before. No one had ever challenged her authority, and rage flooded through her. Rage at this enslaved man who dared defy her, who dared treat her commands as anything other than absolute law. And she struck him across the face with all her strength. And when he did not flinch, did not apologize, did not beg for mercy, she began screaming for the overseer, began screaming that Josiah had attacked her, had tried to force himself upon her, began the lie that would seal his fate but would also begin the unraveling of everything she had built. The overseer came running with 2 other white men. They seized Josiah and dragged him outside, and Eleanor followed, still screaming her false accusations. And they tied Josiah to the whipping post in the yard, and the overseer took the lash and began beating him with a fury intended to kill, not punish. And the enslaved community was forced to watch, as they always were when examples needed to be made. And it was during this brutal spectacle that something broke among the watchers. Some invisible line was crossed. Some collective decision was made without words. That night, as Josiah's broken body lay in the quarters being tended by those who knew he would not survive until morning, a fire started in the cotton warehouse, then another fire in the gin house. And soon flames were climbing into the night sky, and in the chaos and confusion as the white population of the plantation tried to save their property, someone entered the big house. Someone climbed the stairs to Eleanor's chamber, and what happened there remains unclear because no witness ever came forward. But when the fires were finally extinguished and people returned to the big house, they found Eleanor dead in her chamber, her throat cut with a kitchen knife that lay beside her body, and her hidden diary lay open on the bed, open to pages that detailed 3 years of systematic violation, 36 names of men she had abused, dates and descriptions that proved beyond any doubt what had been happening during those full moon nights. Colonel Whitmore found the diary and read it through the night, and by morning he was a changed man, aged 20 years in one night, his face gray as ash, his hands trembling as he held the evidence of his wife's crimes and his own complicity through ignorance or willful blindness. He could have hidden the diary, could have burned it and claimed Eleanor died in the fire, or some other convenient lie. But instead he did something unexpected. He gathered all the enslaved people of Crescent Hill and read portions of the diary to them, acknowledged what his wife had done, and then he did something even more unexpected. He began the process of freeing every person named in that diary, 36 men who would receive their freedom papers within the month, along with small parcels of land and enough money to start new lives. And he never spoke Eleanor's name again, never allowed her to be buried in the family cemetery, instead having her body interred in an unmarked grave far from the big house. Josiah died 3 days after the whipping, died without ever regaining consciousness, died without knowing that his refusal to submit had finally broken the cycle, had finally exposed the evil that had flourished in darkness for 3 years. And the enslaved community mourned him as a hero, as the man who said no when everyone else said yes out of fear, as the man whose death purchased freedom for 36 others. The investigation into Eleanor's murder was perfunctory. The authorities concluded it must have been one of the enslaved men. But with 36 suspects and no evidence pointing to any specific individual, and with Colonel Whitmore refusing to press for prosecution, the case was quietly closed and forgotten. And the truth of who killed Eleanor Whitmore, if indeed anyone did, and it was not suicide made to look like murder, remained a mystery that the freedmen took to their graves decades later. Crescent Hill Plantation never recovered from that night of fire and revelation. Colonel Whitmore sold most of the land and most of the remaining enslaved people, keeping only a small portion for himself, and he lived another 20 years as a recluse, a broken man who spent his final years writing letters to abolitionists in the North, letters describing the evils of slavery, letters that were published in anti-slavery newspapers and cited by activists as evidence of the system's moral bankruptcy. And when he died in 1868, 3 years after emancipation, his will freed all remaining people he owned and left his entire estate to be divided among the descendants of those named in Eleanor's diary. The 36 men who received their freedom because of that diary scattered across the South and beyond. Some went to northern cities, some established farms in the border states. Some even returned to Africa through colonization societies, and they carried with them the memory of those 3 years, the memory of the full moon cycles, the memory of systematic violation. But they also carried the knowledge that they had survived, that they had maintained their humanity, despite everything that was done to them. And they passed these stories down to their children and grandchildren, passed them down as testimony to both the horrors of slavery and the resilience of the human spirit. And if this story made your heart beat faster, go now to the channel and subscribe to discover the other voices that time tried to silence. Because the story of Eleanor Whitmore and the 36 men whose names were recorded in her diary reminds us that evil can take many forms, that oppression damages both the oppressed and the oppressor, that systems which give absolute power to some and no protection to others inevitably create conditions where the worst aspects of human nature flourish unchecked, but also that resistance is possible, that even in the most oppressive circumstances human beings find ways to maintain dignity, to say no, to fight back, and that eventually, inevitably, evil collapses under its own weight. And while the cost is often terrible, while too many die before justice comes, the truth does eventually emerge, and those who suffered are eventually honored, and their stories become part of the permanent record of humanity's long struggle toward freedom and dignity for all.